The newly updated UDL guidelines version 3.0 were released in July of 2024. This video is a quick introduction to the structure of the UDL guidelines, which offer concrete suggestions that can be applied in any content area to reduce barriers, sustain and honor learners' multiple identities, and maximize learning opportunities for every learner. For this video, I will be navigating the interactive guidelines available on the CAST website. According to CAST, these newly updated guidelines are a step towards fulfilling the promise of helping to guide the design of learning environments that more fully honor and value every learner. Across the top, the document identifies the 3 principles of universal design for learning. The first principle calls for educators to design multiple means of engagement to ensure that they can tap into the motivations and experiences of all learners and get them interested in what we're teaching. This principle is about the why of learning. There is not one means of engagement that will be optimal for all learners in all contexts, so multiple means of engagement are essential. This principle aims to honor the learner as a whole. The second principle seeks for educators to design multiple means of representation, where we make sure that we represent knowledge in different ways and ensure all learners have options to help them to internalize the what of learning, in other words, the content that we're delivering. All learners differ in the way they perceive and make meaning of information, and there's not one means of representation that is optimal for every learner. Therefore, designing options for representation is also key. The third principle asks for educators to design multiple means of action and expression, which ensures that we give all learners options for how they navigate a learning environment, approach the learning process, and show what they know. Using this principle, we can honor learners' variability by designing options for varying forms of action and expression. Related information for each principle is listed vertically, and each include 3 guidelines which aim to help guide us to implement the principle. For example, the engagement principle contains guidelines which talk about designing options for welcoming interests and identities of our learners to help spark engagement in the learning process, options for sustaining their effort and persistence with learning tasks, and options for helping students to develop their emotional capacity to manage thoughts and behaviors and empathize with others. All of the guidelines are numbered. Note that all of the guidelines start with designing options for learners in some way. Each guideline contains a deeper level of useful practices which help us in implementing the guideline. These are called checkpoints because they help us to check in and reflect on our practice. These are also numbered in relation to the guideline they sit under for reference. For example, under Guideline 2, Designing Options for Language and Symbols, the first checkpoint, labeled 2.1, is about clarifying vocabulary symbols and language structures. If you click on any of these guidelines or checkpoints, you'll find examples of ways teachers can incorporate them into their lessons. For further information, clicking on the research link will take you to evidence for which the guideline or checkpoint is based upon. While each principle is organized vertically, there is a horizontal relationship between the guidelines in each principle, which tells you something about their purpose. The top row of guidelines are labeled access guidelines because the practices associated with them suggest ways to increase access to the learning goal. The second row of guidelines, labeled support, include guidelines that suggest ways to support the learning process. The final row of guidelines are labeled executive function guidelines because they include guidelines that suggest ways to support learners' executive functioning. At the top of the chart, you'll see the ultimate goal of these guidelines is to promote learner agency, which was formerly referred to as expert learning. Implementing all 3 principles helps us to create purposeful and reflective, resourceful and authentic, and strategic and action-oriented learners. That is, for students to develop a greater mastery of learning itself, which is a skill that can be applied in any field or setting. It can be overwhelming to try to challenge all of your teaching practices at one time. It's encouraged that you start small. Select a few checkpoints that resonate with you to explore first, and before you know it, applying them will become second nature, giving you time to take a deeper dive into options not yet explored. Start with points in your teaching where the most barriers to learning exist, and explore which checkpoints might help to offer greater motivation, understanding, and communication opportunities with your learners.